And I'm going to share my screen and everyone can make fun of there we go. Okay, so welcome everybody to Parsha Unpacked. I'm just gonna mute everyone, but feel free to unmute yourselves at any time if you want to jump in. Generally, we encourage questions and conversation at the end, but if something comes up in the meantime along the way that is, really important that you want to jump in and mention, you can do so. Otherwise, if you have specific questions, try to write them down so you don't forget. If you're like me, you won't remember them by the time class is over, and then we can stay around and have discussion afterwards. So that's ideal. This week is Parsha's Toldos. And tonight's class is sponsored by Doris and Ron in memory of Doris's grandparents, Esther and Mendel Kirschenbaum, and Bluma Mosak, and her half-siblings Hirsch and Miriam, ages 6 and 8, who were murdered in Auschwitz in November and December 1942. So may they have an aliyas haneshama, may their souls be elevated in Shemayim, in the merit of the Torah learning and in the mitzvahs that we're doing. And we should just, Doris and Ron and their children and grandchildren should continue to be a source of nachas for them. Okay, also just want to mention that tonight is Mimi Rosenbusch's late husband Stuart's father's yahrzeit, and his name was Walter Rosenbusch, and that's Shimon ben Schneer. His yahrzeit was today on the 1st of Kislev. Okay, so we're going to begin this week's Parsha, and actually I'll just go back just until we get there. Okay, so let's start by what we've been doing in case anybody's new. The way we've been working this class is that we try to start with an overview, try to unpack the Parsha a little bit, go through just a quick run through of the entire Parsha, and then with the goal of coming back and deeply analyzing and picking apart a few specific sections or parts of the Parsha. So let's begin just sort of with the Parsha overview, Parsha's Toldos. So after 20 years of marriage, Isaac and Rebekah, the second generation patriarch and matriarch of the Jewish people, are childless, and we open up the Parsha and we find them praying for a child. And it says that they both prayed, Isaac and Rebekah, Yitzchak and Rivka both prayed, and Hashem, we'll see, it says Hashem answered his prayer. So there's two things about that. One is it indicates, were they praying for something different? If Hashem answered his prayer, well, if they're praying for the same thing, then it should say Hashem answered their prayer. And also, why did Hashem answer his prayer and not hers? So that's one of the things that I actually want to come back to. So leave that now, and we'll circle back to that after we continue with the overview. Okay, and then what happens is Rivka is pregnant, and she notices that every time, Rebecca, that is, every time she walks by a holy place, a shul, a yeshiva, a place where Torah is being learned, something along those lines, she feels that this baby inside of her is struggling to get out. So she understands that there must be a very holy child. But then if she walks by a place of idolatry, of some place of immorality or idolatry, she notices that the child's also trying to get out. So now she's very confused what's going on. They didn't have ultrasound back then. So what does she do? She does the next best thing. She goes to the prophet Shem. And she asks Shem, what is going on inside of my womb? And Shem basically tells her, you have twins. You are carrying twins inside of your womb. And he tells her that the older one will serve the younger one. There'll be a struggle. There'll be two opposing powers, and the older will serve the younger. That's what she is told. Now, the Medrash takes us a little bit deeper and actually allows us to go inside or put a microphone into her womb, Rebecca's womb. And when we put that microphone in there, we hear that these two individuals inside the womb, who we will soon see are Jacob and Esau, henceforth referred to as Yaakov and Esav. Yaakov and Esav are in the womb and they're negotiating. There's a struggle going on. There's a battle taking place, a negotiation going on between them. And finally, the deal they strike is that Esav, or Esau, will be the one who will possess and be in charge of, and his domain will be Olam Hazeh, this world. And Jacob, or Yaakov, will be the heir to Olam Haba, the eternal world. And that's the agreement that they make. And the commentaries say that this struggle begins within the womb of Rebekah and continues until the end of time. The struggle between Yaakov and Esav, the struggle between spirituality and physicality, the struggle between this world and the next world. This is a struggle that begins with Yaakov and Esav inside the womb of Rebekah and continues on forever. Okay, now the twins are born. So now if you look at the verse, it says that, the verse says over here, oops, let me go back. It says, her time to give birth came, it was at hand, and there were twins in her womb. Okay, and I put in Hebrew, I put the big block, white block around the word tomim, it's twins. Okay, spelled Taf, Vav, Mem, Mem. 4 letters. How many letters are in that word? 4. Okay, good. Now I want you to compare that to a verse 13 chapters later. We'll get there. It's in Parshas Vayeshev, where it talks about another set of twins that are born. And that set of twins is born to Tamar. And it says, Vahi be'es lidita, and it came time for her to give birth. V'hine sit omim bevitna. There were twins in her womb. And here, this is spelled Taf, Aleph, Vav, Mem, Yud, Mem. Okay? Instead of being 4 letters, it's 6 letters. So my question is, did God not have spell check? What happened? It's like God misspelled twins. This here is the correct way to write in Hebrew twins, Te'omim. So why in the previous verse, keep going the wrong way, did he spell it Taf, Vav, Mem, Mem? What happened? What happened? The word changed, the spell check wasn't working that day. So Rashi tells us, Rashi, where would we be without Rashi? So Rashi says, behold, there were twins. The word for twins in the case of Rebekah's twins, our Parsha, our story, is written defective, without an aleph and without a yud. While in the case of Tamar, it is written te'omim with an aleph and a yud. Why? Because in the latter case, meaning the case of Tamar, both children proved righteous, while here one was righteous and the other was wicked. So by leaving out those 2 letters in the Torah, Hashem is indicating to us that these were not whole. These twins were not whole. They were diminished by the fact that one of them was a tzaddik, but one of them was a rasha. One of them was wicked. Okay, who comes out first? Esav. Okay, now Esav in Hebrew. Esav in Hebrew is spelled Ayin Sin Vav. It's very similar. It's directly related to the word in Hebrew, asui. Asui means what? Done, complete, finished. Now, what's the idea? The idea is that Esav, the attitude of Esav, the philosophy of Esav, not only physically, but spiritually and mentally, was, I'm done, I'm complete, I'm born whole. I am who I am. There's no improvement. There's no self-development. Esav wouldn't go to Ali's Wednesday class and learn the 48 ways and learn how to be a better person. Esav is finished. He's fully baked. He's complete. He's whole. He's done. He is who he is. That is the philosophy of Esav. He's not a human becoming, like we like to say, but rather he is a human being, which is the exact opposite philosophy of his brother Yaakov, who believes that we are all human beings, are all about a process of growth and development and self-realization and self-actualization that takes place over the course of a lifetime. Okay, so what happens? The verse says, and the boys grew up. Well, obviously the boys grew up. That seems like an unnecessary statement. Why is it important to say that the boys grew up? Just say, Asa became a skillful hunter, a man of the outdoors, which, by the way, means he was a gangster. He used to go around killing people and stealing. Jacob was a mild man who stayed in the camp. The camp means the tents of Torah. Jacob was a Torah scholar, a Talmud Chacham. But why does it say that the boys grew up? I think that is kind of a no-brainer. That if, they grew up, obviously, they're adults now. They must have grown up. So what's being communicated over here? So of Samson Raphael Hirsch, who we've spoken about in the past, I'm not going to give his biography again. Listen to what he says. It's amazing. And what I love about this is that, again, we see that the Torah, according to Rav Hirsch's explanation, the Torah is not afraid to condemn or to point out the mistakes or to call out the errors of the patriarchs and the matriarchs. If they made a mistake, they made a mistake. And Torah is going to call it out so that we can learn from it. There's no infallibility in Judaism. So here's what he says. When the boys grew up, in verse 27, that was our verse, the one we just quoted, is to emphasize that while it was prophesied and known to Rebekah that the boys would be quite different, she and Isaac nevertheless raised them in precisely the same environment and with the same methodology. This was their mistake. The striking contrast in the grandchildren of Abraham, talking about Jacob and Esau, may have been due not so much to a difference in their temperaments as to a mistake in the way they were brought up. No attention was paid to their differences while they were little. Both were given the same teaching and educational treatment. Had Isaac and Rebekah studied the nature of Esau and spoken to that nature, who can say how different the history of the ages may have been recorded? Wow, Rav Hirsch takes them to task, but that's okay, because that's what the Torah is. The Torah is from Hashem to teach us lessons. And basically the idea over here is that we don't treat every child the same. There's no such thing as two children in a home who are the same, who should be brought up the same way. King Solomon says, Chanoch hanar al pi darko. We have to raise a child according to darko, his unique way. The obligation of a parent is to find out the unique qualities of their child, what drives them, what excites them, what motivates them, and to teach toward that and to build and develop that, and not to take a cookie cutter approach to parenting where one approach fits all. So that's what Rav Hirsch explains about that pasuk. So as we see, Yaakov grows up to be a man of the tent, a great Torah scholar, a very spiritual individual. Esav grows up to be a gangster, and the Torah continues. And we read about that great famous lentil soup incident. What's the lentil soup incident? Jacob is cooking his lentil soup. It's the food of mourners because they were sitting Shiva, because on that very day, Abraham had just died. Esav comes in from hunting, which means he comes in from killing and pillaging, and he's hungry, he's starving. He says, give me some of that red stuff, pour it down my throat. And Yaakov says, hold on, I will give you this red stuff, but first I want you to sell to me in exchange for this red soup, this bean soup, the lentils. I want you to exchange it for your firstborn rights, the right for me to be the next leader in the third generation of patriarchs. So Esau says, what do I care about this patriarch stuff? I'm starving. Give me the food. So he gives him the lentils, and Esau sells his destiny and his role as the potential patriarch, being the firstborn, for a bowl of beans. That sounds like an amazing story when we read it, like how stupid could he be? But the truth is that we do this ourselves all the time. On a lesser level, what do? We sell out our potential. We sell out who we can be, who we have the ability to become for some form of comfort or some sort of ease. That's all Asa was doing. It wasn't worth it to him to become the patriarch of the Jewish people. He wants food. I'm hungry. So on a certain level, we all make this mistake over and over again in our lives. Okay, moving on. There's a short little section that takes place about Isaac, about Yitzchak. Now it's fascinating because the Torah tells us so little about this second patriarch, Isaac. We learn a whole lot about Abraham. We'll learn even more about Jacob. But when it comes to the middle patriarch, Isaac, we don't find much about him at all. What do we hear? We find out that there was a famine in the land. And just like his father went down to Egypt, Jacob also wants to go down to Egypt, but God tells him, no, you have to stay here in the land of Israel. The next thing we find out is that he goes to the place called Gerar, and he pulls his father's shtick. He says, no, this is not my wife, this is my sister. So he uses that technique out of his father's playbook. The next thing we know, he's redigging the wells that his father dug. And that's pretty much what we find out about the life of Yitzchak. So why does the Torah tell us so little? So just a quick insight over here, and this is really meant to be a topic of its own that we can study in more depth, but what did Yitzchak innovate? What was Isaac's innovation? What was his contribution? Abraham was the trailblazer. Abraham laid down the pipelines of communication with God. Abraham was the one who discovered monotheism and taught it and blazed that trail. And what was Yitzchak? What was he? So his innovation is that it's not always the time for innovation. His innovation was sometimes you don't innovate, sometimes you consolidate. And his role was to take everything that his father and his mother had created and built with their wild, innovative, creative, out-of-the-box, endless energy and take that and consolidate it. That's what it means that he redug the wells that his father dug. His father dug wells. It means his father accessed deeper levels. But the Philistines filled that in because when a person's a visionary and a person has a great creative mind, but sometimes there's no staying power to the ideas or concepts that they innovate. They get filled back in very quickly by the next people that come along. The Philistines filled up the wells that Abraham dug. Isaac's role was to go back to those very same wells and redig them, to consolidate what his father built, to solidify it, to make it real, to take it from a fleeting, trailblazing new idea and turn it into a whole reality, a system that would perpetuate and be permeated throughout the generations. That's the role of Yitzchak in the patriarchal lineage. Okay, now we find out that after he digs those three wells, then there are three more wells that get dug. And there's like a whole conversation about the wells, and it's weird. Like, what's it doing? What do we care? Isaac dug a well. The Philistines argued with him and fought over it. It's our well. No, it's our well. Then Isaac digs another well, and the Philistines argue with him. It's our well. No, it's our well. And then finally he digs a third well, and the Philistines let it go. Like, what is going on over here? Here's the verses. When Isaac's servants digging the wadi found there a well of spring of water, the herdsmen of Gerar quarreled with Isaac's herdsmen, saying, the water is ours. So he named that well Asek, because they contended with him. Asek means contention. And when they dug another well, they disputed over that one. Also, he named it Sitna, which means hatred. He moved from there and dug yet another well, and they did not quarrel over it. So he called it Rechovot, which means expansiveness, saying, now at last Hashem has granted us ample space to increase in the land. So why is this even here? So there's an idea, there's a concept. The concept, we don't have time to really go into it in depth now, but it's called Maisa Avos Siman Labanim, which means that the actions, the recorded stories and actions of the patriarchs and matriarchs are not just there to tell us about their lives and what they did, but they're also there to forecast and foreshadow all of Jewish history. All of Jewish history is encoded into these actions and incidents and episodes and narratives that we read about the patriarchs and matriarchs. So look what Nachmanides has to say about this incident. Truly fascinating. He says, Nachmanides, and we did a biography on Nachmanides before, so I'm not going to remind you who he is now. You can go back and look. The Torah relates and goes to great lengths about the matter of the wells, even though the story simply understood serves no purpose. Okay, there were wells. In truth, there's a hidden matter contained in this incident, for it comes to inform a future about inform us about a future event. For a well of water in the Torah is a hint to the temple of God, meaning the Beit HaMikdash in Jerusalem, which the offsprings of Isaac would build. And he called the first well Asek, contention, which alludes to the first temple, over which our enemies contended with us, engaging us in many conflicts and wars until they destroyed it. He called the second Sitna, hatred, a harsher name than the first one. It alludes to the second temple, which is called by that very name. And all its days, the enemies were hateful to us until they destroyed it and we went to terrible exile from it. He called the third well Rechovot, an allusion to the future temple may be rebuilt speedily in our days. It will be built without conflict or dispute, and God will expand our borders. As it says, Hashem will expand your boundaries. He swore, which he speaks of a future time. And our verse concludes, and we will be fruitful in the land, alluding to the fact that in the future, all nations will serve him with a single resolve. So this little story about the wells, which seems unimportant and insignificant, is actually a tremendously important story, alluding to all of Jewish history, the future of Jewish history, and the three temples in Jerusalem. Wow. Okay. Moving along in the overview. Now, I remember last couple of weeks we pointed out that God promised Abraham the land of Israel. But we also said that doesn't necessarily mean it belongs to the Jewish people, because God promised Abraham. Abraham had two sons. He had Isaac. He also had Ishmael. So there was three possibilities. Either the land goes to Isaac, or the land goes to Ishmael, or it's divided, a two-state solution. Well, here we go. In verse 20, chapter 26, verses 2-4, God is speaking to Isaac. Hashem appeared to him, Isaac, and said, do not go down to Egypt. Stay in the land which I point out to you. Reside in this land, and I will be with you and bless you. I will assign all these lands to you and to your heirs, fulfilling the oath that I swore to your father Abraham. I will make your heirs as numerous as the stars of heaven, and assign to your heirs all of these lands, so that the nations of the earth shall bless themselves by your heirs. Okay, so we've knocked out Ishmael. He's not the heir to the land of Israel. Who gets the land of Israel? Isaac. Woohoo! That means what? It's ours, right? Not necessarily, because Isaac also has two sons, Jacob and Esau. So again, there are three possibilities. Either the land belongs to Isaac in its entirety, or either it belongs to Jacob in its entirety, or it belongs to Esau in its entirety, or a two-state solution between the descendants of Jacob, the Jewish people, and the descendants of Esau, the Western world, the Western European world, Rome, etc. So we still don't know for sure that it's ours. We'll keep an eye on that. Okay, next thing that happens, Jacob and Esau. Jacob takes the blessings from Esau. It's a very famous story, a whole topic unto its own. Isaac is blind. He calls for Esau to come. He wants to give him a special blessing. Rebecca, she hears this. She knows what a disaster it's going to be if Isaac gives the blessing to Jacob. She calls Jacob, dress up, go pretend to be your brother. And the whole episode where Jacob steals the blessings away from his brother so that he could become the next patriarch. The aftermath, Esau is furious. I'm going to kill him. He decides he's going to kill him as soon as his father dies. I'm going to kill Jacob. Rivka understands this. She sends Jacob away, and off Jacob goes to live with Uncle Lavan and Besuel, and that is the end of the Parsha. Okay, so that's the Parsha overview. Now what I want to try to do is focus a little bit more on two specific areas of the Parsha. One is, let's go back to the very beginning. Okay, this is the very beginning of Parshas Toldot, and it says, this is the story of Isaac, son of Abraham. Abraham begot Isaac. Guys, we know that already. Why is the Torah telling this? We've known this for a while. Since last week's Parsha already, we know that Isaac is the son of Abraham. Abraham begot Isaac. It seems unnecessary. The Torah doesn't waste words. That's a question. Isaac was 40 years old when he took to wife Rebecca. Took for himself a wife, Rebecca. It's a typo. Daughter of Besuel, the Aramean of Padan Aram, sister of Lavan, the Aramean. We also know that. We know who Rivka is. We know that Rivka's father is Besuel. We know that Rivka's brother is Lavan. This whole entire 2 sentences in the beginning of the Parsha seems unnecessary. We know they got married. We know their backgrounds. We know their lineage. What's going on over here? Okay, so Rashi points out something very interesting. When it comes to Rebecca, it points out who her father was and who her brother was, because it's coming to praise her. She was the daughter of a wicked man, the sister of a wicked man, and her native place was of wicked people. And yet she did not learn from their doings. Rebecca overcame everything. She overcame the terrible upbringing that she had in the home of wicked people, wicked individuals, horrible people, Besuel and Lavan, 2 of the most wicked people in the Torah, in a place filled with wicked people. And what did she do? She overcame it. She saw through it. She had her own strength. She found her own, because normally people are a product of their environment, but she was able to break through. 1 in a million are able to do what Rebecca did. So we understand she was about tshuva. She was someone who did not grow up in the religious environment of Torah or of spirituality. And yet she found out on her own and overcame it. That's a remarkable thing. Okay. Now the verse goes on and says that Isaac pleaded with Hashem opposite his wife because she was barren. Now, what does it mean opposite his wife? Lenochach ishto. Isaac prayed or pleaded with Hashem opposite his wife. What does that mean, opposite his wife? So very simple. Rashi tells us they were in their house. They were in the living room, and he stood in one corner. He had his little corner where he prayed, and she had her little corner where she prayed. Is that really interesting? Does that really matter? Do I really care where they stood in the house? And he was in the living room, and she was in the dining room, or she was in the family room. Does it make any difference what part of the room, what corner they were standing in? What's the Torah trying to tell us over here? That they stood in opposite corners and prayed. Okay. Now, the next thing that happens is we go back and we see, I'm going to answer these questions, don't worry, that Isaac pleaded, he was opposite his wife, right? They're in opposite corners, they're praying, and Hashem responded to his plea, okay? What does this mean? His and not hers. His and not hers. So first of all, they must have been praying for different things, right? They must have been davening for different things. Okay, Rashi points out right away. And second of all, why? Why did he answer Isaac's prayer, not hers? So Rashi tells us, because you can't compare the prayer of a righteous person who is the son of a righteous person, that's Isaac, right? He's the son of Abraham and Sarah. And the prayers of a righteous person who's the child of a wicked person, that's Rebecca, the daughter of Besuel. Therefore, God allowed himself to be entreated of him and not her. Question. Isn't that a complete contradiction to what the Torah was just trying to tell us? The Torah was telling us how amazing Rebecca was, that even though she came from such wicked people, and even though she was the product of this terrible upbringing, she still overcame it. How amazing is that? Even more remarkable. And we know that the Talmud says that the heights that a Baal Tshuva, somebody who comes to this reality of Torah on his own, and was not brought up with it, the place that person reaches is higher on the mountain than any other person can reach. So are we finding out over here that that God answers his prayer, Isaac's, instead of hers, because Isaac had righteous parents and she doesn't? It seems like a complete contradiction to everything that we know and understand. Okay, we're going to answer these questions now. Last week I mentioned the Kotzker Rebbe. The Kotzker Rebbe was one of the great Hasidic giants. And he has an interpretation on this story that sheds light, and I believe will answer some of these questions. But in order to understand the Kotzker Rebbe, we have to travel back in time to the Garden of Eden, where God says, don't eat from the tree of the knowledge of good and evil. I'm sure that you've had this question in the past. Why would God not want Adam and Eve to eat from the tree of knowledge of good and evil? What do you call a person who has no knowledge of good and evil? A psychopath, right? So why would Hashem not want Adam and Eve to have the knowledge of good and evil? Why would he want them to remain without that knowledge? It doesn't make any sense. If anything, you would think God would say, eat as much as you can from the tree of knowledge of good and evil. Go to town on the tree of knowledge of good and evil. Don't refrain from eating. So the Kotzker Rebbe explains that the tree of knowledge of good and evil means that eating from that tree would create, which it did, a new reality where good and evil exist together in an admixture. Before eating from the tree of knowledge of good and evil, there was absolute good, absolute evil, and no confusion whatsoever. But when Adam and Eve eat from the tree of knowledge of good and evil, they ingest inside of themselves confusion, lack of clarity. Everything that's good now has some evil in it, and everything that's evil now has some good in it. There's no such thing as a person that's purely good without evil. There's no such thing as a situation which is purely good without evil. The boundaries are blurred, and everything gets mixed up, okay? And the majority of mankind, most human beings, cannot separate and distinguish and separate out the good from the evil. So it's a complete cholent of good and evil, and there's no way to separate these things out. That's why God didn't want Adam to eat from the tree of knowledge of good and evil. So the Kotzker Rebbe explains that the role of the patriarchs and matriarchs, what they began, the process that they started, which becomes our job and our responsibility to continue on from there, is a slow process of reversing that trend, which he calls the rectification of Adam and Eve's sin. Adam and Eve sinned and brought confusion of good and evil, moral confusion, blurred lines of morality. The role of the patriarchs and the matriarchs and the role of Judaism is to clarify and to remove that blurring of the lines of good and evil and morality and immorality. And that's the purpose of the Torah. The Torah is there to teach us right and wrong, good from evil. The positive mitzvahs in the Torah are to orient us towards and to teach us to adopt good. And the prohibitions in the Torah, the things that the Torah tells us not to do, is to steer us away from evil and the incorporation of evil into our essence. Okay? When Mashiach comes, when does Mashiach come? When does Messiah come in the end of days? Messiah comes when we complete this process. There's a famous statement in the Talmud. The Talmud says, in Sanhedrin, Rabbi Yochanan says, the son of David, that's Mashiach, that's the descendant of King David, Messiah, will come only in a generation that is entirely righteous or in a generation that is entirely wicked. I get the first part, but why would Mashiach come in a generation that's entirely wicked? Does that make any sense? I was always troubled by that statement in the Talmud. I get it. Mashiach will come in a generation that's entirely righteous. But why does he come in a generation that's entirely wicked? So the Vilna Gaon says, this interprets this statement in the Talmud to mean that Mashiach will come when this process that the patriarchs began of spiritual polarization, where the process of separating out good and evil and removing the confusion and the mixture of good and evil that happened through Adam and Eve, the rectification of that initial mistake of Adam and Eve is complete. And good is pure good again, and righteousness is pure righteousness, and evil is pure evil. That's what it means. That's the end game. That's when Mashiach comes. So the patriarchs and the matriarchs started this. Abraham started this. Abraham had two sons that were diametrically opposed in their nature. He had the righteous and holy and pure and spiritual Yitzchak, and he had the wicked and evil Yishmael. Now comes the second generation, Isaac and Rebekah. And it comes time for them to pray for children. And they're in their room, opposite corners. They're praying for different things. Why? Because they understood that their role was going to be to continue the process that Abraham had started and continue this process of separating out and polarizing the good and evil. And they anticipated that just like Abraham and Sarah had one righteous son and one wicked son as part of this process of polarizing, separating out good from evil, removing the confusion, removing the blurring of that line. So they thought that they too would have to continue that process. Okay, that they would have one righteous son and that they would have one wicked son, and that would be the price to pay for being the next generation of patriarch and matriarch, that they would have to have that wicked son to continue this process. Yitzchak, Isaac, grew up in the home of Abraham. He saw Abraham and Sarah and how they dealt with this challenge of having a wicked son and a righteous son. He had a template to deal with it. He saw in his own home how this could work and how it could be dealt with. He understood how that it was possible, and he wanted this righteous son so badly that he was willing to accept the reality that it would come along with a wicked son. Okay, so he's praying for an extremely righteous son, knowing very well that that would mean that he would also have an extremely wicked son. But since he saw it done in his house and he has the template and he understands how it could work, that's what he's praying for. But Rebecca, she had a very, very different upbringing. She grew up in a house of evil. Her father, Besuel, was a terrible, wicked man. Her brother, Lavan, was even worse. She lived in a home of wickedness and evil. She couldn't bear the thought of possibility of having to see that again repeated in her own offspring. So she also prayed, but she didn't pray for the same thing that Yitzchak prayed for. Yitzchak prayed for an extremely righteous son, knowing that it would carry along with it an extremely wicked son. She didn't do that. She prayed for a moderately righteous son, knowing that if her son was moderately righteous, that there'd be a moderately wicked son that would come along with it. And that was the most she could handle. That's what the Kotzker Rebbe says. Now let's go back. This answers all of our questions. First of all, question number one. They're praying in opposite corners. And Rashi says she stood in one corner, he stood in another corner. What does that mean? It means because they had divergent experiences. Their experiences in life were divergent. They had different viewpoints. They were davening for opposite outcomes. That's what it means. It's not telling us where they were standing in the room. She was in this corner, he was in this corner. No, it means they were in two different places spiritually. They were looking for two different things when they were praying. They weren't praying for the same thing. Okay? And then we had that verse in the beginning, remember? Abraham was the father of Isaac, and he begot Isaac. Yeah, we know that. Rebecca had a brother, Besuel, and a brother, Lavan. Yeah, we know that already. Why are you telling us this? Because what the Torah is telling us is why they were davening for what they were davening for. Yitzchak, who was the son of Abraham, had a template to understand how to deal with polar wickedness and polar righteousness. So that's why he was davening for what he was davening for. Rivka, who had a father and a brother who were horribly wicked people, she couldn't get herself to daven for a fully righteous, absolutely righteous child because she knew it would bring her a wicked child and she couldn't accept that. So it's not telling us their lineage. We know their lineage. It's the sentence before the story about them davening in opposite corners to tell us why they were davening in opposite corners, why they were davening for different things. Okay, and then we had the question that Rashi says that you can't compare. It's not the same the prayer of a tzaddik, of a righteous person who's the son of a righteous person, to the righteous person who's the daughter of a wicked person. Rashi's not saying one is better or weaker, stronger or weaker. He's just saying you can't compare them. They're praying for different things because of their different life experiences. They're not praying for the same thing. He was praying for a tzaddik, extreme righteous person. She was praying for a moderately righteous person. And finally, we understand when the Torah says that God answered him and not her, that's what happened. They had two kids. Whose prayer was answered? It was his prayer that was answered. They had a completely, incredibly righteous son, Jacob, and a wicked son, Esau. And they continued this process that Abraham had started in the generation before them of separating out the good from the evil. That was part of the beginning of the process of the rectification of the sin of Adam and Eve, of eating from the tree of knowledge of good and evil, where good and evil become blurred and morality becomes obscured and obfuscated. Okay, that is the explanation for that section. Okay, if you have questions on that, maybe hold on to them until the end, write them down, and we can deal with it. And I want to just kind of unpack one last section or one last idea, and then we will wrap it up. Okay. So the Torah tells us in chapter 26, God appears to Isaac and he says, I will make your heirs as numerous as the stars of the heaven and assign to your heirs all these lands so that your nations of the earth, so the nations of the earth will bless themselves by your heirs. Why? Because as Abraham obeyed me and kept my charge, my commandments, my laws, and my Torahs. So first of all, just a side point. In Hebrew, the word for because is usually ki. Ki. Here, the Torah uses a different word, akev, which is an unusual word for because. In order to understand what this is being, the message over here, we need to look at the numerology for a minute. Go to our numerology chart. Somebody figure this out. Akev, ayin, 70. Kuf, 100. Bet, 2. What does that equal? 172. So what is it telling us? If you read this as a number and not as a word, it says, not because Abraham obeyed me and kept my charge, but rather 172 Abraham obeyed me and kept my charge. Meaning what? Abraham kept my commandments and my charge for 172 years. Beautiful. But there's a problem. How old was Abraham when he died? 175. What did we learn a couple of weeks ago about Abraham? That he began a search when he was 3. He began his process, his spiritual journey when he was 3. And for the next 45 years, he tried out every form of idolatry. What was Abraham doing from age 3 to age 45? He was like, in the fraternity house. No, God forbid, he wasn't in the fraternity, but he was trying out every form of spirituality, every idol worshiping methodology, every religion, every form of idolatry, until for 45 years later, it became 48, and he finally concluded there's one God, monotheism. So how many years did Abraham serve God? Not 172 years, but 127 years, from the time he was 48, and he concluded one God, until the time he was 175 when he died. So why does it say he listened to God for 172 years? And here's a beautiful insight that I've shared with you before, which is that when a person is on a spiritual journey, when a person begins seeking for truth, seeking for God, seeking for God's oneness, it doesn't matter that the credit is not from when they reach the conclusions ultimately that they're going to reach, but they're credited, so to speak, with serving God, not from the day that they reach the conclusion, but from the day they begin the journey. It's the day they take that first step and they embark on the journey that they begin serving Hashem. Even if it takes them years and years and years to get there, quote unquote, they're already serving Hashem from the day they take that first step. Okay. But that wasn't my point that I wanted to focus on. What I want to focus on, it says here that Abraham obeyed me, kept my charge, my commandments, my laws, my Torahs, referring to the written Torah and the oral Torah. But I have a question for you. The Torah was not given to the Jewish people for 500 years after the time that Abraham lived. So what does it mean Abraham kept my laws, kept my Torah? That's not true. How could that be? 500 years later, the Torah came into existence. How do you keep a law and a Torah that doesn't exist yet? So the Talmud tells us, the Babylonian Talmud, Tractate Yuma, Rav said, Abraham, our patriarch, fulfilled the entire Torah before it was given as it is stated. And it quotes our verse, because Abraham hearkened to my voice and kept my charge, my mitzvot, my statutes, and my Torahs. So the Talmud is using this verse as proof text, that Abraham kept the Torah before it was given. And that's a very famous concept that we know, that the patriarchs and matriarchs kept the Torah before it was given. Fine. My question is how? How did they know? How do they know what to do? Where did they get it from? So that's what I wanted to share with you. So there are many interpretations of this. I'm just going to share two of them with you. One is from Rav Levi Yitzchak of Berdichev, also known as the Berdichever Rebbe, one of the great Hasidic masters who wrote his famous commentary in the Torah known as the Kedushat Levi, the holiness of Levi. And he says something very fascinating. He says, follow along, because this is Kabbalah now. This is a little bit Kabbalistic and a little bit mystical. He says that based on the Zohar, the source of Kabbalah, he says that there are 248 mitzvahs in the Torah, which we know, and those 248 mitzvahs in the Torah correspond to the 248 spiritual organs or parts of the body. And there are 365 prohibitions in the Torah. And these 365 prohibitions refer to a different 365 spiritual sinews or parts of the spiritual individual. Okay? And he says, just like the Zohar says that just like physical organs and part of your physical body, just like they need nourishment and nutrition and sustenance, so too do the spiritual organs and parts of your body. They also need spiritual sustenance. And he says that each limb, each organ, each sinew of the spiritual body receives its spiritual sustenance from a particular mitzvah in the Torah. So the 248 positive mitzvahs nourish and sustain 248 spiritual parts of the human person, and 365 prohibitions sustain and nourish and give nutrition to 365 different parts of the spiritual person, and together the person is fully nourished spiritually. And then he takes it to another step and he says, just like the physical limbs and organs don't need to be taught what to do. No one has to teach the heart how to beat. No one has to teach the lungs how to breathe, right? So too, our spiritual organs, so to speak, don't need to be taught what their function is. They have the particular mitzvah, how to perform the particular mitzvah that corresponds to them. They get it. These spiritual components within us, they know their mitzvah. They know the mitzvah that pertains to it. They know how to perform that mitzvah. They know how to carry out that mitzvah. So within us as human beings, we already know all the mitzvahs in the Torah and how to do them and how to carry them out. But if that's the case, then why does the Torah ever need to be given at all if we have it within us already? And the answer to that is because the physical world acts as a mask that hides or conceals from us spiritual knowledge and spiritual elevation. But certain individuals were so high and so spiritually elevated, like the patriarchs and matriarchs, that for them, the physical world didn't get in their way. They were above the physical world. They saw above it. And therefore, within their own body, within their own limbs and organs of their spiritual makeup, they understood the mitzvahs. They understood how to perform the mitzvahs. They understood what it needed to be done and how to perform them. For the rest of us, we needed a Torah. So 500 years later, Hashem gives the Torah to the Jewish people that teaches us. But for the patriarchs and matriarchs, they knew it internally. Okay, that's one explanation. The other one, I think, is even more fascinating. Okay, and that is, we're going to wrap up with this. So we know that there is a famous statement in Pirkei Avot, the Ethics of Our Fathers, that with 10 utterances, the world was created. God created the world with 10 utterances, 10 sayings, Asara Maimarim, 10 verbal things that God uttered when he created the world. Okay? And according to Jewish tradition and really mysticism, these 10 utterances also correspond to the 10 commandments. How so? So each utterance, each ma'amar, each ma'amar as they're called, contained or concealed within it one of the 10 commandments. Just like a fruit is contained within a peel, or a grain is contained within the husk, hidden and concealed, right? But it's there. And the 10 commandments exist within the 10 utterances. Now, we also know that the 10 commandments, why were 10 commandments singled out? According to Rav Saadia Gaon, all 613 commandments are contained within the 10 commandments. Okay, which means that the 10 utterances of creation contained within them the 10 commandments, which contain within them the 613 commandments, but they were concealed, like grain is concealed in the kernel or in the husk, or like fruit is concealed in the peel. So what needed to happen before these 10 commandments could be revealed or removed, like the fruit removed from the peel? Another set of 10. What was that? The 10 plagues. The 10 plagues, which were a complete and total revelation of God's power on earth, above the earth, below the earth, on the earth, was a process of beating the kernel and removing the fruit from the peel, or the grain from the husk. The 10 commandments, the 10 plagues removed the 10 commandments from within the 10 utterances. Okay, so because what's the next thing that happens in the Torah after the 10 plagues? The next thing that happens is God gives the 10 commandments to the Jewish people, because now they're available. The 10 plagues removed them from concealment and hiddenness within the 10 utterances, and now they're available and they're revealed. Okay, so from when did the 613 commandments exist? They existed from the beginning of time, concealed in the 10 commandments. The 613 commandments were concealed in the 10 commandments, and the 10 commandments were concealed in the 10 utterances. They were there from the beginning. It took the 10 plagues to reveal them for most of humanity. But Abraham and the patriarchs and the matriarchs, because of the spiritual level that they were on, were able to peer into the hidden world and understand those 613 commandments even before they were removed from the 10 utterances through the process of the 10 commandments, through the 10 plagues. So that's the idea. But the question remains, if the 613 commandments, if the patriarchs observed the 613 commandments before they were given, that means they kept all the commandments before they were given, right? Including, for example, Pesach. So we learned a couple of weeks ago that Abraham, when the angels came to visit Abraham in the tent, he said to Sarah, go bake 3 saws of choice flour and knead them and make cakes. And the commentaries point over there, what were the cakes? They were matzahs, because it was Passover time and they were celebrating Passover. And we see another reference to that in this week's Parsha. Isaac tells Jacob, or he tells Esau, go to the flocks and fetch me 2 choice kids, and I'll make them a dish for your father. Oh no, that's Rebecca speaking to Jacob. And Rashi says, why 2 choice kids? Because it was Passover time. One was going to be for the Paschal sacrifice, and the other one was going to be food. So you see, they were keeping Passover. Abraham and Isaac and Jacob, they were keeping Passover. But here's the problem. Passover is the celebration of the Jewish people leaving Egypt. But how can you celebrate the Jewish people leaving Egypt 100 years before they even went into Egypt? How does this work? How do you say that the patriarchs kept, if fine, they kept the mitzvah, they couldn't have kept Passover. Passover is the celebration of the departure from Egypt, which happened hundreds of years later. They hadn't even gone into Egypt yet. And here's the final idea for tonight. This is an idea that the Zohar, the source of Kabbalah, says. I have it here on the bottom. It says, Istaka baraisa bara alma, that when God created the world, when God created the world, he looked into the Torah to create the world. The Medrash explains that the Torah was like the blueprint. Just like an artisan doesn't build on his own accord, he defers to his blueprints. So to Hashem looked into the Torah to create the world, which means that the mitzvos in the Torah existed before God created the world. You see, we think in the following terms. We think that God created a world. And then, for example, he looked at his world and he said, oh, you know what? Wow, there are people in this world that I just created, and some people own bulls and some people own oxes, and I didn't realize this was going to happen, but sometimes one guy's bull can gore another person's ox. I better create a law for that. So God writes in his Torah, when one man's bull gores another man's ox, he shall pay so-and-so. Or we think that, God created a world, and in that world, he created parents and he created children. And maybe he saw sometimes kids aren't so respectful to parents. So he said, I better put a law in my Torah that says that a child is obligated to respect his parents. Okay, that's how we normally think of things, but that's not the case at all. The exact opposite is true. What the Zohar is telling us and the Medrash is telling us is that God looked into the Torah and read that there's a law in the Torah, in the blueprint. And that law says, if one man's bull gores another man's ox. So now we said, now when I create the world, I have to create a world in such a way where there are bulls and there are oxen, so that this law in the Torah has a physical venue for it to be manifested, carried out. Or he looks and he sees in the Torah that it says, if you should honor your parents. So he says, okay, well, I've got to create a world where there are children and parents, so that this law in the Torah has a place to play itself out. That's the correct understanding of the relationship between the Torah and the world. God looked into the Torah, saw the laws in the Torah to create the world, which means that God looked into the Torah and sees that there's a law called eating matzah on the 15th day of Nisan, or there's a law that says bringing the Paschal lamb on the 14th day of Nisan. So God looks into that and says, okay, I have to create a world where historical events are going to be such that there'll be an exodus from Egypt, so that this law in the Torah has a venue to play itself out. Okay, so the truth is that the laws in the Torah preceded the historical events that they relate to. It's just that the Torah in its essence, the mitzvah in its essence, has some inherent value and meaning. And therefore, God has to bring history about in such a way that those mitzvahs have a reality to exist within, based on the historical events and episodes that would take place. So Abraham and the patriarchs keep the Torah before it's given, because the Torah exists way before they do. And the laws of the Torah exist. They exist from the beginning of time, concealed in the 10 commandments, which are concealed in the 10 utterances, which for the most of the world needed to be revealed after the 10 plagues. But for the patriarchs and matriarchs who lived on that higher spiritual realm, they were able to access that wisdom without the plagues to reveal them and to bring them out into the open. Okay, so that's a pretty intense idea. We can discuss it. I'm going to stop the recording, and I'm going to give everybody who wants a chance to comment, ask, fight, argue, challenge, or any of the above, or all the above.
How about the idea, David, that Isaac represents Gevurah and Jacob represents Chesed, and the tension between the two is where and the idea is to get into the middle and embody both of those things.
That's Jacob, and Jacob is the embodiment of the two.
Right.
That's exactly right. That's 100% right. And that's, Gevurah, Isaac's Gevurah, what that means is solidification. It means taking Abraham's chesed. Chesed is outpouring. Chesed is excitement and energy and out there. And Gevurah is inwardness, and taking those sparks and bringing them into a physical reality that's going to be perpetuated. Yeah. Yeah. Any other questions, thoughts? Just want to again reiterate. Yeah, Maria. Yeah.
Rabbi David, you didn't really talk too much about this part. Well, maybe a little. I think it pertains to the wells, but when Isaac was talking to Abimelech, and then Abimelech told Isaac, "Go away from us, for you have become much stronger than we." So what's going on there? Could you talk about that a little bit?
Yeah, so that's what happened when Isaac went, when there was a famine, and instead of going down to Egypt, God told him to stay in the land. So he went to this place called Gerar, and he gets to the place called Gerar, and there's a king there, and his name is Avimelech, and they have contention. They have this struggle, and one of the things that happens is he takes Isaac's wife, because Isaac pretends that it's his sister, and then it says Avimelech looked in the window and he saw that they were not brother and sister. So he got mad, and he's about to, he says, "Why did you lie to me?" He didn't take his wife. I'm sorry. He said he notices this and he says, "Why did you lie to me?" And he tells him to leave. So they're fighting. They're arguing over that. They're arguing over the wells. But ultimately, Avimelech realizes and recognizes that Yitzchak is this giant of a human being, that he's a towering spiritual individual, and that what he's creating, what he's building has infinite quality and power way beyond anything that he could contend with. So he basically asks him to leave. He sends him out and says, "I'm no match for you. You're on a different plane altogether. You're spiritually, much greater than I, and I don't want to. I want to have a pact with you. I want to have a bris, a covenant with you, so that we will remain friends and not in future arguments or contention."
Got it.
Okay.
Thanks.
Sure. Other questions, comments? Les.
A comment. It seems to me that Abraham, Yitzhak, and Jacob were actually the first people to use the scientific method, because one way of looking, I think, at what was going on is they were able to infer the reality of the Torah by examining the physical world they were living in.
Yep, that's a very good point. That's another explanation of how they knew the Torah. So they looked at different creatures and different systems in the universe, and they learned and derived the ideas and the principles of the Torah from those systems. So yeah, that's a good point. They were utilizing science in that way. Yeah. By the way, I just want to point out, if anyone here on the call has not added your name and email to the daily email list, the email list for reminders for this class, just put it in the chat right now so we can add it in there so we don't forget about it.
David,
Yeah.
Hashem wrote the Torah. Sorry. So why did he have to look into it to figure out what he had to create?
So it's right. It's obviously meant to be on some level, an allegory or a lesson, a concept. But the idea is that the world is a manifestation of the Torah, and the Torah is not a manifestation of the world. Meaning that God didn't create the world and then create the Torah afterwards to deal with it. He created the physical world based on the principles, ideas, values, concepts of the Torah. That's what it means. It's not that he had to look in the blueprint. I mean, he created the blueprint.
Right.
But yeah, that's the concept. Okay, well, if there are no other questions, I just want to say one more time that tonight's class was in memory of Doris's family, and they should all have an Aliyas HaNeshama, and we should all just see good things coming in the future. Everyone should be healthy and safe in the meantime, and as soon as we have an exact date for the town hall meeting, I'll make sure everybody knows when that's going to be so we can all participate.
Thank you, David.
Okay. Lila Tov, everybody.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you, everyone. Thank you, Rabbi
Thank
David.
you.
See you next time.
Bye-bye. Lila Tov.
Bye, everyone. Have a good night. Be well.
Thank you, Rabbi.
Thank you.
Welcome. Bye. Thanks, Susan. Bye.